You have a whole movement on the right for pastors to, quote unquote, like speak their minds and speak truth.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in Washington, D.C.
Preaching directly on political and sort of culture war topics. And that's going to have a long impact. An administration is only 4 years, but that's like reshaping the American church for the next generation.
It has been an extraordinary year in the news, and each year we like to look back at some of the most important stories happening in the area of religion and democracy. This week, we'll look at some of those stories with religion journalist and New York Times national reporter Ruth Graham. We need these conversations to be happening now more than ever. If this is something you care about, make sure you subscribe, share, and rate the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast platform. Help more people learn that religion is meant to be a bridge, not a bludgeon, and that none of us are alone in this dangerous time. Our library of past conversations includes well over 100 hopeful, empowering, and inspiring interviews with guests like Sister Simone Campbell, Eric Ward, Representative James Tallarico, Reverend Otis Moss III, Sushma Dwivedi, Reverend Jim Martin, and many, many others. You can help grow the State of Belief with a financial contribution. Find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Ruth Graham is a New York Times national reporter covering religion, faith, and values. She is the recipient of awards from the Religion News Association and the American Academy of Religion. And she has had a busy year with amazing headlines like Pete Hegseth and his battle cry for a new Christian crusade. First among Christians, young men are more religious than young women. Piety and profanity, the raunchy Christians are here. I mean, all of these headlines. I mean, don't you listeners, I know you're like, oh my God, I've got to get to the New York Times and read these pieces if you haven't already read them. So Ruth is the perfect person to have with us to review just this changing religion landscape and culture, but also just the big stories of 2024. It was a major year for religion stories. So Ruth Graham, welcome to the State of Belief.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's so much to talk about 2024, but first, let's just talk about you. What's your background? Like, how do you come at this, specifically writing about religion, which is such a particular beat?
Yeah, it's the best beat, in my opinion. I think it's never-endingly fascinating. But I was raised in an evangelical home and community and church in the Midwest in Illinois. I went to Christian schools, kindergarten to 8th grade, and then again to an evangelical college.
Wheaton, right?
I went to Wheaton. Yeah, that's right. I had a great experience there. I really did. And I learned a lot, and graduated, moved to New York City, got into journalism. I think I'm like the very end of the last generation of people who could just sort of fall backwards into it without, going to get my journalism degree and all that. So I just went straight out of college. And really initially it was that because I had this evangelical background and this was the Bush administration, there was a lot of like curiosity and anxiety in the mainstream media about kind of realizing like we don't understand these people. I think all of that has gotten actually a lot better. But at the time it was a little bit exotic to have come from this background. And so that was initially just, I was able to start pitching ideas based on just having some kind of special insight there. And then honestly, over the years, it has just, I won't go over my whole, LinkedIn, but it has just continued to be a really, really fascinating beat to me. And of course, with, in 2016, with Trump winning, that kind of overturned the whole evangelical landscape. Everything was upside down. And there was a whole bunch of new, different stuff to report on then. So it felt like just sort of remaking the whole beat in a lot of ways since then. So I've been at the Times now for more than 4 years. And yeah, have far from run out of interesting things to report on.
For sure. And, it goes from, obviously, politics was a big story, but you already hinted at this. There's things going on A lot of your stories, but not exclusively, about around evangelical, because you write about a lot of different things, but
Mhm.
you do have some really interesting insight into evangelicals. One of the stories that I read with fascination that I think actually kind of dovetails with politics is a little bit what you presented, that there's more young men going to church than young women. And that really not only flips a 20th century narrative, but it flips a long standing narrative that women are the backbone of the church, women attend more, women are more religious. Those are all almost truisms. And yet you turn that upside down in this really interesting piece. Can you talk a little bit about how you came upon it and then what you discovered while you reported it?
Sure. Yeah, that was one of my favorites from last year. And in hindsight, I think, especially sort of post-election, it felt like maybe the most important story I wrote last year. So, like you said, it's nearly like a universal human truth, not even particular to Christianity, that women are almost always in almost every context around the world, particularly in Christianity too, that just women are a little bit more religious than men. And so this switch of that in Gen Z started to appear a couple of years ago. I read about it first in Christianity Today. Ryan Burge, he's
Yeah,
a
he's been on the
theologian who
show.
writes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, he's
writes
interesting.
about this stuff, wrote a little item about it for Christianity Today. And I was really struck by it then and kind of tucked it away in the back of my head and kind of just kept an eye on it. And there's further research since then, even in just those last few years, that yeah, young men are more religious, and it's particularly clear in with Christian young men in the US just because there's so much more data there because it's such a bigger set. But they attend services more often. They're more likely to identify as religious. And that tracks with, just a gender gap in this generation on a lot of stuff, including, support for Trump. There's a huge gap there where young women have moved notably left in their politics and young men have tacked right. So not only there's this interesting thing happening with young men that are, becoming more conservative by some measures, but it's also a widening gap with young women, which raises some sort of alarming, possibilities for the future. But I went to Waco, Texas to do the reporting and attended a couple of church services there and met with a bunch of young guys and also young women. And yeah, it's just a really fascinating scene where these guys and not every young man has the same set of concerns or background or all of this, but just sort of a yearning for something firmer. For one of the young guys told me, men are attracted to hard truths, so he went to kind of a more conservative church, was being drawn into this more conservative church with this search for hard truths. Yeah, so a lot of different, everything from like pornography addiction to came up, but just sort of searching for something more rooted, and a lot of times that's expressed in more traditionalist and more conservative religious communities.
Well, and I think there is something for men who are like, well, wait a, there's it's almost this well, this is my speculation. I'm certainly not putting on the, but it's almost a response to, the kind of, oh, men are under attack. And in these conservative churches, there is a reassertion of kind of
Yeah.
patriarchal norms. Like men are the leaders of the church, women have a role, an important role, but it's in relationship
Mhm.
to men's leadership, and I think for some men who have been feeling estranged, it feels good to be like, okay, like we're back in a place where this is respected, and yet what was interesting about that article that you wrote is you also interviewed women who kind of were seeing the same things but almost a mirror image of it.
Yeah, that's right. And these women, some of whom had stayed in the church. One woman who was in the process, she was in seminary and hoping to be ordained, who had, were raised Christian in some form, but were seeing a lot of, yes, exactly, seeing the same things in the church and really wanting to get away from it. I think the closer that, the Republican Party and Trump specifically, that those brands are kind of intertwined with evangelicals Christianity specifically, but for a lot of people, just Christianity. That is causing a lot of young women, again, who have moved left in their politics for a variety of reasons. You think about the sort of post-Roe era that we're in,
Yeah.
maybe attuned to gender, sexuality stuff in different ways. A lot more young women identify as not straight in some ways. So there's this big exodus among women.
Yeah.
And then
Have
that
you
has a compounding effect, right? Because then it's like, well, my girlfriends aren't there, so it's a sort of snowball effect.
have you followed Christian Dumais effort? She was on the show talking about, and
Mhm.
she did this documentary, very kind of not too long, but it really for our daughters, that was an offshoot of her John Wayne book. And I'm just hearing like echoes of that, like women, I'm not grafting that onto your piece, but it just makes me think of that, these realizations of women, and then men also like being like, we're not we're not going to take it, and I, that just feels like it's a real dynamic in a lot of the more conservative churches, especially kind of doubling down on who gets to run the church, so I think it's, we're in a very interesting moment when a lot of change is happening, and at the same time a lot of change is happening, there are reactions to that change. And of course, in religion, that is, really huge. I do want to kind of make you know, make a little bit of a jump into how you saw religion play out. You wrote a couple different kinds of stories, several different stories about how religion was playing out in both the Trump sphere, but also in the Harris sphere. How did you like see that dynamic? Because that was such a big part, of course, of 2024 in our national reporting.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the last time you and I spoke maybe was for a story about Kamala Harris's faith and faith background, and got a little bit into Democratic outreach. Um, I don't think, she didn't speak that much about faith or that often to, church audiences, faith audiences until really near the end of the campaign. Neither she nor Donald Trump are perceived by voters as particularly religious. She has a really fascinating story to tell. She just didn't tell it that often, but really kind of embodies this like multi-faith pluralist moment that in a lot of ways the United States is in. Certainly that's the direction the Democratic Party is increasingly headed in, really becoming a more secular party over time. And so it's tricky. I sympathize with the difficulty of figuring out as a Democratic candidate kind of how to speak that language in the appropriate moment, but also realize that some people are really turned off by the language of the church.
Mm.
It's a real tightrope act. And then, of course, Trump, who a lot of conservative Christians who are, happy to vote for him are pretty clear-eyed that he's not exactly one of them. It's kind of like bringing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on and then forcing him to eat the McDonald's hamburger. Like there's a little sense of like, this guy is on our
That
side.
is
He doesn't
really
exactly live our values necessarily. So, that's interesting too. I do think this cycle that conservative evangelicals have kind of moved on from having to be in perpetual, explanation and excuse mode. And, I talked to a pretty prominent Trump pastor supporter who just said, like, we're kind of done, I mean, he talked to me, but he's like internally, like, we've kind of just made our peace with the fact that like this guy is on our side, getting things done on our behalf, and it's not a character contest. I'm personally really curious how that plays out the next time there's, sort of a question of character or not. Like, have they sort of given up their, ability to criticize the next person who comes along? But that's the sort of peace they've made for now. So there's a lot
yeah.
less sort of internal dissent and drama on the conservative Christian right over that.
You mentioned like he's on their side. Like, what were the articulated values that you felt were really motivating MAGA Christians, or however you would, I mean, it's tough because there's a lot of evangelical Christians, not a lot, 20% maybe, but some very prominent ones who never bought into the Trump train, but many did. For those who did, what were the most important issues, and how are those going to be delivered on or potentially delivered on in the coming administration?
Yeah, I mean, you hear people talk a lot about abortion. Trump bills himself as the most pro-life president in history, or at least he did until, he didn't talk much about it this cycle. But people certainly remember, his remaking of the Supreme Court to overturn Roe. So he still gets a lot of credit for that. A lot of evangelicals are really keyed into sort of transgender issues, gender issues more
Uh-huh.
broadly. There's a lot of anxiety around that, and especially how it intersects with schools. So that's a big one I hear. They are really concerned about immigration. There's a lot of course, overlap just with Republican voters in general. So immigration is a big issue.
Immigration is tricky because the only reason that the evangelical church writ large, hasn't cratered completely is a lot of immigration of evangelicals. It's very
Or
curious to me.
immigration of Catholics who become evangelical in the
Yeah,
US.
right, right. So a lot of like immigrants then become evangelicals and quick. I don't know, like that. Did you ever like, were you ever to sort that out? Because that's a big, seems to be still a lingering question mark. Like where do those immigrants who turned anti-immigration and who also are identifying with the more evangelical Trumpist movement?
Yeah, I too find that sort of hard to parse out. I think, there's a lot of people who would say they're not opposed to it overall, but they associate it with, other concerns about sort of disorder and, volume and all of this, so that it's not necessarily wanting fully closed borders. I mean, there's such a rich, kind of mainstream evangelical history of welcoming the
No,
stranger
for
and
sure.
refugees, and so that really
Yeah.
is their agency
Because
and
Jesus talked about it, and and so did the prophets. I mean, it's like actually a pretty prominent idea in scriptures. So to me, and this is, I'm not again speaking as Paul Rauschenbusch, it feels much more of a Christian nationalist adoption. Like this is a Christian nation. We're worried about other people who are corrupting that idea. But if you can come in here and be totally exactly like us, great.
right.
Well, immigration is one element, but now that Trump is president-elect and he's beginning to nominate people who have been kind of broadly lumped in with this Christian
Mhm.
nationalist title, however blunt that term might be. You had an article, Pete Hegseth and his battle cry for a new Christian crusade. That's a very powerful title. Can you unpack that for our listeners?
I did this reporting with Mike Baker, my colleague on the national desk at the Times, and we were really just looking. I mean, it was right after the Hegseth nomination, and so we're looking into, all of us on the desk and the other desks too, looking into sort of every aspect of his background and what he said, and he's talked and written a lot, and apparently had, some kind of major. I don't want to call it a conversion experience, but like an intensification of his faith a couple of years ago where, again, to sort of take his own account for it, the way that he described it, where he and his family, his third wife and their blended family, I think they have seven kids, picked up a couple of years ago, and they moved to just outside Nashville, specifically to send their kids to this small classical Christian school there. They started to attend a church there that's associated with the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, which is a denomination that was co-founded by this pastor out in Moscow, Idaho, named Doug Wilson, who is very conservative. He's reformed, which means he's sort of Presbyterianish. We don't we don't have to get all deep into
Yeah,
the
yeah,
theology,
yeah.
and he has this sort of empire out in Moscow, Idaho, where a lot of people have actually moved over the years to be, a part of his church. There's a college there, there's classical schools there. He also has this kind of network of classical schools. So a conservative, pastor who has really become increasingly influential over the course of the Trump era. He's a real kind of provocateur, I guess is one way to put it. And again, very, very conservative. So it was interesting to us to see Pete Hegseth, come into this church. He has spoken highly of Doug Wilson. They have never met, or at least that's what Wilson told me, that they've never met. Hegseth has never sort of been out to Moscow, but you can still kind of trace his thinking about some of this stuff, or this is one of his influences, I guess I would say. And so Wilson describes himself as a Christian nationalist, and he has his own kind of precise definition of that, which is related to basically, the idea of, well, if the opposite of that is secular nationalism, that's something that doesn't work. And he frames it in terms of wanting to like limit the power of the government against Christians. Again, that's kind of his description of it. But I always think it's interesting to look at, here are people that are going to have immense power, and how do they think about really the most fundamental, like the meaning of life, the uses of power, all of these things. So yeah, we dug into that. And, Hegseth had done a lot of his own writing where he's really speaking warmly of the Crusades and kind of wanting to revive the reputation of the Crusades, suggesting that, well, if it comes to that again, you'll want a crusader on your side. I'm very much paraphrasing there, but kind of, bringing back some of this language and ideas of the medieval Crusades, which is,
Yeah.
Again, really remarkable, since that's something that a lot of contemporary Christians have, tried to reckon with, and saying like, wow, that was a really dark period of Christian history. So it's remarkable to see him kind of want to resurrect that.
Yeah. And the fact that he might be in charge of the military,
Yes,
which is
exactly.
like, it's one thing for some random person in their basement to be thinking that way. It's another thing for someone who has the keys to the most powerful military in the world. Up next, more with Ruth Graham and the top religion news stories of 2024. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is religion journalist and New York Times national reporter, Ruth Graham. I am curious, how you understand movements, and if you did any stories about other faith traditions and the kind of diversifying of the religious landscape in America, because even as there's been kind of upheaval and shifts in the evangelical community and in the wider Christian community, there's also so much going on in broader religious landscape. What were some of the stories that, even if you didn't write one, you were like watching something going, oh, that's interesting, that's going to mean something?
Well, certainly the long and really distinct rise of the nuns, NONES, is, I think, arguably going to be sort of the story of the next 5-10 years, maybe more, because yes, there are these fascinating movements kind of on the Christian right, the right more broadly, but we're becoming a more secular country. So even some of those nuns, or nothing in particular, people who just really don't think of themselves as religious people, who don't go to a house of worship, have those beliefs, a lot of them are conservative. So what does the secular right look like? I mean, I think we're sort of getting a flavor of that already. But also, the secular left. And again, what are the implications of the Democratic Party becoming a more and more secular party? That's really fascinating to me. I think we're still in the long fallout of October 7, so there's big stories, I think, about Judaism in America. Some Jews kind of turning inward, seeking, realizing we need to really hone in and turn back to our traditions. Maybe some political realignments going on there. I mean, I think that's some really fascinating stuff. Yeah, I don't know. That's a couple, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Are there,
Have you?
what about you, Paul? Can I
Well,
ask you? What do you think I
I'm
should be
really,
writing about next year?
yeah. Well, I'm really interested in how diaspora from other parts of the world plays out here. I think
Mhm.
South Asian diaspora and
Mhm.
how the broader kind of realities, political realities of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all of that among different Hindus, among the Sikh
Mhm.
community, Indian Muslim communities. I mean, it's just a very interesting, like, everything is complicated. And in some communities where there are high concentrations of South Asians, you can't predict how the religion will play out unless you dig into it. And so I think that that's going to be a really, as part of the interfaith movement and as the constant like effort to, not just have it be, Muslim, Jew, Christian. I hired the first Hindu chaplain in the country when I was at Princeton.
Oh,
And I think, we did a really great job, really good guy. And he was from one positionality in a really big ecosystem that he had to then balance. And that's true for every religious leader. Like if you hire, like I also hired one of the first Muslim chaplains before I hired them. And, are you hiring, you're hiring a Sunni? Are you, what about the Shia? Can everybody come together? Like, how does this work in the diaspora? But then how do tensions come over here? And certainly October 7th, we saw that, play out. But I do think there's going to be more and more of that happening. And it's already happening in some ways in the South Asian community.
yeah.
So I think that's really an interesting area. And I'm curious, you mentioned like Hegseth talking about classical schools and this
Mhm.
question of schools and this idea of what is the public contract and like how does religion and education how do they come together? And what is public education? What's the future of public education? As you have people who really want to dissolve it. One way to do that is school vouchers or putting more religion into public schools. I'm curious if you're seeing, I mean, you're in Texas, the
Yeah.
chaplain's bill happened there. There's probably going to be 10 commandments that will come back up, school vouchers. What does that mean for a public school, which really is meant to be for everyone, given the rising diversification and also the less religious people? And so,
Yeah.
like, what does it mean to put more? I'm curious, like, have you seen any trends in that area? Did you see any reporting that you thought was particularly interesting?
Yeah, there was a fantastic piece in the New Yorker by Emma Green about the classical schools movement that
Mm.
really captured, because of course, yes, it is a favorite of like the Pete Hegseth types, but there's all different, kinds of kinds of people who are drawn to classical schools right now. And that was a really like fascinating, nuanced piece about that movement. Um, because I think some of that comes from sort of across the spectrum, some dissatisfaction with testing and these other elements of public schools, not necessarily sort of culture war stuff. Um, I'm doing a story right now that's connected to homeschooling, which has also risen tremendously over the years. So that's another, you're seeing, some percentage of kids not in the public school system because of homeschooling. And so, all these things do kind of, yeah, chip away at that system and raise questions about like, well, what is public education for? What is education for? What do we owe our kids? Like it's yeah, it's big, really complicated stuff. And yeah, some of the Ten Commandments, the Bible mandate in Oklahoma, you're also seeing kind of empowered legislators in red states, see what sticks, like throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks, knowing that depending on how far this stuff makes it, that they'll have a receptive Supreme Court, um, or at least a decent chance of that. So it's an interesting time, just trying to keep track of everything happening in these states is a big job.
Yeah, it's a big job for those of us who are also in the religion and
Mm.
democracy space, like just watching what's happening and being like, okay, this is going to be an interesting legislative session for sure.
Yes.
How do you, without divulging secrets, but like, Because I was in that world for about 6 or 7 years and close to it for a decade or more. The question of like, what do we cover? Like, what do we put our resources towards to cover versus nice to have, but not necessary to have? These are, I think a lot of it is our, just like our antenna, and also like what really is, you can see, oh, this has all the ingredients of a rich story and it's an important story. If you don't mind divulging the secrets, like how do you go
Oh,
through like a soup to nuts? Like how do you like, I heard about this, oh, that sticks with me. I mean, I'm just curious what your
no.
what your process is, because you're at arguably the most important paper. You're telling stories that mean something to people. You're in a really interesting moment and an important, have an important role.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not a formula. I would say, the question that I will get from my editor when I bring a story that might seem sort of small or odd or, not necessarily like the next day's like top of A1 is, well, what does this have to say about American religion or about the country more broadly?
Hmm.
So as long as I can answer that, I do a lot of, and actually I love doing like quote unquote small stories or that again aren't necessarily that every reporter is chasing it and it's the obvious big like, story about the intersection of politics and religion, but a story that kind of comes in through a particular religious culture and captures people's enthusiasms, excitement, fears, anxieties, like all of this. Because, I think it's my job to help people like understand the country. So I think of myself as, more often covering sort of the pews versus the pulpit or or versus Washington. So I the week after the election, I went to the National Bible Bee in Orlando, which is all these little like homeschooling kids reciting incredibly long passages of the Bible. And that's a story that is like it's not directly a politics story. In fact, in some ways, it's like the direct opposite of that. And it was sort of refreshing to be, be in Orlando that week instead of Washington. Um, but I hope that it was also a window into this particular, conservative Christian culture and how they were talking and thinking about shaping their kids and, priorities for the future and all of that. So yeah, again, it's very much not a formula. And I kind of do all, of course, I do the straight, the Pete Hegseth story too. But there's a lot of other stories to be told that, still have some kind of window into the American religious landscape.
Yeah. Part of the interesting moment we're in is that we can certainly bemoan it, the internet, just the proliferation of like frankly garbage, but there is also the opportunity to learn more about
Mhm.
stories that you might not have heard about if you're kind of open to it, because people are telling their stories. There's a lot of witnessing going on actually, and a lot
Mhm.
of like sharing, and I just want to let you know that this is what's going on with me. And having been involved in the kind of religion journalism beat for a while, and there's a lot of lamenting about like how many papers have gotten rid of religion reporters. But there's also hopeful signs of people still being able to learn about one another, hopefully, and also like being aware of some of the impact of some of these stories have on real lives. And how are you seeing colleagues in your field deal with this new reality around religion and media? Or maybe that's not something you're really paying that as much attention to, but are we telling the stories that need to get told?
Um, I mean, we can always do better, but I totally agree with you that you know, social media, I mean, yes, so traditional media, the declines there have been really devastating. I do find it really sad how few places now have dedicated religion reporters or even, sort of religion literate reporters who sort of bring that literacy to reporting on other topics. I sort of, I always think that that could be better. Although I will say, I also think it's sort of not as bad as we sometimes have a reputation for among some believers. Um, but yeah, I totally agree with you also about social media and just all the different ways that people have of sharing their own stories. And I mean, I'm grateful for that. Even as a reporter, I mean, did a story about like LDS women last year, sort of sharing all of their stories around, sexism in the LDS church last year. And that was like an Instagram phenomenon. Like all these women are extremely Instagram savvy and kind of got together, and it snowballed and, became like a real sharing and connecting space for them, to the point where it did rise to, that was a story in the Times. And so I don't know how or whether that would have happened. It certainly wouldn't have happened sort of as quickly, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Those voices just would have been much, much, much harder to hear and access and put all of that together. So, um, it's there are certainly there are pluses and minuses, but in some ways there's sort of religion everywhere you look. It's
Yeah.
if anything, it's just sort of it's winnowing down and sifting through and deciding, not overweighting the sort of social media dust up, right? You don't want to just have Twitter be your assignment desk. So it's being judicious there too. But boy, it is so fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of what I was doing was watching on social media, finding stories and stories that started on social media, but then, very much grew because of social media.
Right.
But then all of a sudden you needed a broader picture of it. So if you had a headline for 2024
Oh my
and
gosh.
religion, I know it's really like this is impossible, but it's meant to be a fun exercise. Not, I'm not holding you to it. But
Yeah.
I do think like what would you say is the headline, and then maybe the tag that goes underneath, like of 2024 religion in America.
Oh, 24. Okay. I thought you said 25, and I was like,
No,
oh,
we're going to
what
get
do
to
you mean? And
that.
I'm
So
like,
get
I don't
ready.
know yet.
If that stressed you out, your stress was not unwarranted or wasted. We will get to that. But 2024, like looking back, what's the headline of 2024? For religion in the United States.
Oh man. Well, there's a reason I'm not a headline writer.
That's so funny. People forget that reporters rarely
Yes.
decide headlines. That's like a really important like media literacy thing.
Yes.
So if you're mad at a headline, yelling at the reporter is generally not your best move because
Exactly. Read the
there's
whole
all.
story and then yell at me, but I did
Yeah,
not
yeah.
write
Read the whole
that
story and then yell at Ruth. That's a good. If you take anything away from it, that's what I want you to do. Yell at Ruth only after you've let. But it is, I
Right.
mean, headlines are. There's all sorts of calculations that go into headlines, and not all of them are how does it serve the story. But for a headline of the United States in 2024 for religion.
Um, I think it is the comeback of Trump and what that means for Christian power in the US, and also for the church itself. I mean, I don't know if that's the number one most important story, but it's the one I find myself most interested in, is just the ways that Trump is also um, reshaping, yeah, the church. So I think if we saw the first, this is very much not a headline, but if the first Trump administration was sort of, that was a populist movement where you saw people, churchgoers and Christians sort of being more conservative than their pastors often. And I reported that story a few years ago of these kind of mainstream evangelical pastors being like, whoa, like my church is actually like really gung ho for, Trump and the Trump agenda. Like, how do I kind of shepherd them? I think now, a couple years have passed since then. The pulpits are getting remade. So you have a whole movement on the right for pastors to, quote unquote, like speak their minds and speak truth, and which in this context means being much more direct in preaching directly on political and sort of culture war topics. And that's going to have a long impact. An administration is only 4 years, but that's like reshaping the American church for the next generation.
I think like how the Trump election is shaping the American evangelical movement, and then underneath, you know, almost the return of the power of man.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. There you
so
go.
okay, yes,
You-
I'm that no, actually that
That worked
was
for
like
me.
we used to have so much fun with headline writing when I was at HuffPost, because
Yeah.
it's all about like how do you get people to click. You're above that at the Times, but but yeah, I mean, I really do think that that's a huge story. I mean, it's analogous to the Republican Party, the way people
Yeah,
talked about the
absolutely.
Republican Party. Like, it used to be that senators and many of the quote unquote elites of the Republican Party were very adverse to Trump and very reluctant, but went
Mhm.
along with it because the rank and file. That's all gone.
Exactly.
Everybody's fully like behind it, and
Yeah.
and it's really interesting to see how this, whatever it is, like this cult of personality and this almost like, well, this is, again, I'm not ascribing this to Ruth at all, but like kind of a very, reversal. Well, this is Make America Great Again, a reversal of much of the what has happened over the past 30 years. And like, how do we push all of that back, whether it's women's rights, LGBT rights, black people. It's really like it's rooted in a lot of that very conservative and going back to that time. And so and it's going to be fascinating how that ultimately impacts the church, because I do think you're going to find, you know, it will, the church will continue to shrink. I
Yeah.
don't think this is going to mean like a rapid expansion of the church, unless you
Yeah.
include church. I think like there's another thing that's happening at the same time. Like people like the Proud Boys are identifying as Christian because
Right.
it's become a different kind of identification than I'm following Jesus. I'm really interested in like what Jesus said on Sermon on the Mount. Like that's not, it's a different identity. And that is actually really a very interesting. And then, from my point of view, because I stand on the other side of the Christian community, like how what is happening on the Christian right, it will impact what is happening in mainline churches. And, many of whom have been drawn into the Trumposphere. But then there's another part of it, which is very much like positioning, and I'll speak for myself, positioning myself as oppositional to it. And so
Right.
it is, it's an interesting moment. And then all around that, you have people who are not religious. You have Jews. You have Muslims who are trying to figure out where they fit now. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, and of course, as I mentioned, South Asians. It's really interesting. Okay, the thing that caused you to have a panic attack, I do want to ask
I
you,
know.
and so now we're going to come to that. I promise to like to stress you out. Not a crystal ball, but as you think about these dynamics and you think about what lays ahead, what are some of the dynamics that
Mhm.
you see that may not require but invite a lot of storytelling around?
Yeah. Um, okay, that's better than having to come up with one headline. I mean, I think some of because really, if the headline of this year really is just from November, then that's absolutely going to flow into next year. So just the continuation of how Trump is changing Christian culture. You're absolutely right about sort of what this means for the Christian left, and for the main line, which, those aren't exactly the same things, but some overlap there. I think right-wing Christian power in general, and kind of how that's expressed under a very friendly administration. I am totally fascinated by what's happening in the Catholic Church. And of course, we don't know exactly what will happen next year with the Pope and all of that. But in the US, there's a really energetic kind of traditionalist wing on the right. You know, Women seem to be leaving the Catholic Church. I was just reading a little bit about that. Women leaving conservative Christianity more broadly. And yeah, those are a couple of the things I'll be sort of the
Yeah,
dynamics I'll be
it's a
paying attention
real,
to next year. Yeah.
it's really, one of the big themes is how politics is shaping religion,
Yes.
rather than religion shaping politics in a way. I
Yes.
mean,
Yeah.
that's very reductive, but I mean, it is the dynamics that are drawing people into the church and forcing people out of the church have a lot more
Yeah.
to do with the political questions facing us than I'm compelled by the spiritual wisdom and practice. I mean,
Oh,
maybe I'm misrepresenting that, but maybe it goes hand in hand for people. But it's really an interesting, and honestly, it feels dangerous and sad to me. But at the same time, I'm not making big statements about it. But I fear for religion and the way politics
Say,
are
yeah,
totally shaping it.
I think that's right. And I mean, I literally just framed it that way myself. And I do think broadly, religion right now in American culture is downstream of politics. I will also say, as a reporter who talks to people and travels like all over the country and talks to all different kinds of people, most people don't talk about or see their faith through the lens of national politics. So
Mm,
it is one thing to observe these big trends, and that's real. I think, the exodus of women and all of that, like, that's real. That is connected to what's happening in national politics. But individual people are so individual. And so religion is not dead, spirituality is not dead, faith is not dead. And a lot of people just don't view their faith lives through this prism at all and are finding deep spiritual wisdom in all different kinds of places, finding beauty, finding spiritual truths. I don't know. And I think it's easy to despair thinking that it's this kind of one-to-one relationship, and people are more complicated than that. So I don't know.
no,
Don't just,
I think that's a really good corrective. I mean, even my family goes to church, and there's generally some but it's really like there's all sorts of other things about personal life and
exactly.
deep connection to the faith, and so it is important. If you look at these big stories and big trends, it's really hard to miss, but it is important. It's really important, and I think a lot of our listeners are people of faith, but not
Mhm.
all. But a lot of our listeners are, and I know that we're not automation,
Right.
reacting to politics for sure. People are going and getting all kinds of things out of there, and
That's right.
everybody has these. We all have very complicated lives, with like loss and love and all kinds of stuff going on at the same time. And so it's just really important to thank you for pulling us back from that brink. But, and that almost seems like it could be a story. Like, in the face of all this politics swirling around, people still do have to bury their loved ones,
Yes, that's right.
and people still are bringing their kids and having them baptized or christened, and bar mitzvahs are still happening. Bat mitzvahs are still happening. So,
People
and
need potlucks. It's a core human
yeah,
need.
yeah. That's good. That's very, yeah.
No, but you're
Um,
right. That's exactly
yeah.
right.
So really helpful.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate the role of journalists, of storytellers. And it's really, when you get a story and you feel like you've done it justice, there's
Mm.
something really beautiful about that. I remember when we first started HuffPost Religion, and Javed Kaleem at that time. I don't know if you
Mhm.
ever
Oh
ran
yeah.
into Javed,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
he's a really great guy, and he was our senior religion reporter. And there was a story that like everybody was just laughing at, and it was really like it was kind of laughable. But the end of the world was coming.
Mm.
And do you remember this? There was a
I remember
prophet.
it's like 2012 maybe or
Yeah,
11.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and that's
Yes.
exactly right.
Mhm.
And we were just like, let's try to embed with someone who really believes
Yeah.
this and why and like what it felt like.
It's
And
the
it was
best.
such a, it was, I was like so moved by that story because of course the 80% of me that's very just like, oh,
Yeah.
come on. I
Yeah.
mean, like, yeah, this is like ridiculous. But for the person who's like, was going through a lot of difficult things and really just like, oh, we're gonna be free of that. Like
Yeah.
something really good is going to happen. I
Right.
mean, and that's how they understood it. And they understood it as something they could do as a family, and they were going to make sacrifices for it and all of this. And
Mhm.
then, and then it didn't happen, and telling that kind of the whole arc of it, but not
Mhm.
like, not painting people as terrible or stupid, but
Mhm.
somehow like trying to find good and trying to tell the story, in a way that's generous. And I think that's your stories have that generosity, and so I really want to commend you for the way you tell stories and the care that you
Mm.
take with people's stories. So thank
Thank
you
you.
for that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate
And
that.
yeah, and thank you for directly predicting everything that will happen in 2025.
Hold me
So
to
that
it.
Journalist Ruth Graham covers religion, faith, and values as national reporter for the New York Times. Her writing is compelling and insightful, and her social media accounts are well worth following. So find them. What are your social media accounts? Tell us.
Oh, I'm at Public Road on Twitter, and now I'm more active on Blue Sky. It's at Ruth Graham. That's
At
easier.
Ruth Graham on Blue Sky, and
Yes.
so definitely follow on social media. Happy holidays, Ruth, and thank you for being
You
with us
too.
today
Thank
on
you
The
so
State of
much.
Belief.
Yeah, great conversation. Thank you.
I'm sure you know someone who would get a lot out of this conversation. So please share The State of Belief with them, and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. If you'd like to make a financial contribution, go to stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.